Chris Elder. There we go. Thanks for coming. My name is Chris Elder. I'm a senior planner with Whatcom County Public Works. I've served as the county's lead on what we're referring to as our Whatcom Future Shorelines project. The whole goal of this effort is really to try to collect a lot of the best available science that gets at what is looking like some of the future projected climate impacts that we're going to experience here in Whatcom County. I'm super thankful for Department of Ecology providing funding for this. This is our phase 2 effort. So they've entrusted us to dig a little bit deeper. Super thankful for our consultant team with Herrera and Cascadia. We also have folks from Makers. So hope that tonight can be pretty informational. We're just trying to start to get a lot of the information out there, give you what some of this best available science is, give you some inside looks at some of the adaptation strategies we're working on, and hope to collect some of your feedback and input as we go through tonight. So this is really our kickoff. We'll have more products coming out in the future, but thanks for joining us, and I'll pass it over to Rachel.
All right, next slide, please. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for spending your Monday evening with us. We're hoping to cover a variety of topics tonight. We have some time first for welcome and an overview of this project. Then we'll be talking about future shoreline changes in Whatcom County before getting into some adaptation strategies, so how we can deal with those changes. And then we'll end with a summary and some next steps for how to follow along with this project and continue to stay engaged. Next slide, please. And so our goals for today is to just share more about this Whatcom Future Shorelines project so you all understand where we've been, where we're going. Discuss flooding and erosion vulnerability in the county. So what we know about what type of infrastructure and resources are going to be exposed to flooding and erosion, both currently and going into the future. And then to introduce a range of adaptation strategies that could be considered to help address the flooding and erosion vulnerability. Next slide, please. So just a couple housekeeping things, since this is a virtual meeting, we ask that you please keep yourselves muted. However, if you do have questions, please put those in the chat. You're welcome to use that to provide input. And you can access this by clicking the chat button that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you're having any technical difficulties, Osamu is on board to help support. So you can either put a note in the chat to him or send him an email and he can help you access that. And we will be using a polling software as well throughout this evening. So if you're having any issues with that, feel free to reach out for that too. All right. And so to kick us off, we have a poll here that we're hoping that you all can contribute to. We'd really like to know what brings you here today to this meeting. And you can join this by going to a browser or using your phone by scanning that QR code. In the chat there, Osamu has the link, so you can drop that into your browser and you should be able to join. You can also join by text by texting 22333 and sending a note Cascadia. So we'll give folks a minute to respond. And as soon as people start putting in responses, we'll start to see those pop up in the screen here. We'll give folks a little bit longer. It can take some time to get logged in. Seeing learning as one, climate, property, people maybe who are representing other groups, curiosity, questions, concerns about impacts. Hopefully we'll touch on many of those. All right, thank you very much. We'll have a few more polls throughout the evening, so please keep that, that window up. All right, so now we're going to start with just an overview of the project here. So you can go to the next slide, please. So as all of you know who live in Whatcom County, the geography of Whatcom County is really shaped by water with our marine shorelines and our river systems, including the Nooksack River, as well as numerous lakes and streams. Next slide, please. And so with this project, we really have a focus on the shorelines of Puget Sound, as well as the shorelines of the Nooksack River. All of the shorelines in the county, though, are constantly being shaped and changed by wind and by water, and development and land management also change those shorelines. Next slide. And so flooding and erosion are major challenges along these shorelines. In the county, there's about 82 square miles of floodplain. And while flooding and erosion are natural events, they can also be extremely dangerous, destructive, and expensive, which I don't think is news to anyone who's joining this call here. We've seen major flooding and erosion events along the Nooksack River. Just highlighting a few recent ones here, the 2021 November flooding that was extremely destructive to many people, and erosion that also has resulted from flooding and impacting infrastructure like roads and other critical utilities. And then we've also seen flooding and erosion along our shorelines in Puget Sound. 2022 flooding with king tides and elevated water levels caused a lot of damage in coastal communities. And then we also see issues with bluff erosion all along our Puget Sound shorelines. And I did want to add too that Whatcom County is really not alone in dealing with this. Across the country and across the world, many communities are struggling with increasing challenges with flooding and erosion. Everywhere from Louisiana to Florida to Oregon to North Carolina and Missouri. I think that's some of the representation of images that we have here. And so with flooding and erosion, we know that there's changes that are going to be coming. Currently, there's about 82 square miles that are in the current floodplain. And then next slide. Going into the future, when we look to the 2040s and the 2080s and beyond, we know that with changes to precipitation patterns and sea level rise, that we're going to see that floodplain area grow much larger to close to over 100 square miles. So I'm going to pass it to Chris here to give a little bit more background about this project and the goals.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly flag that this is phase 2 of what we're now calling our Whatcom Future Shorelines project. Phase 1 was really focused on utilizing a U.S. Geological Survey model called the COSMOS model, which stands for the Coastal Storm Modeling System. It's some recently available data in the Puget Sound region. Whatcom County was actually the first county to get access to this. So we're able to try to do what you see there, a compound flood vulnerability assessment to identify what structures and other assets are at risk based on sea level rise with the compounded storm surge. The other benefit is we were able to model some of those historic, some of them recent history, riverine flood events and try to get a better understanding of how those riverine floods interact with the changing sea surface in those coastal storm events as well. So we wrapped that project up in roughly 2024, and that kind of launched us into this phase 2, which is looking at some additional parameters, including further up the river. Next slide, please. Just to try to review some of the goals we have for this project, a big effort has been to bring together the county, the cities, the tribes, as well as other jurisdictions. We do have a collaborative project team, which includes reps from all the small cities, both the tribes, Washington Sea Grant, U.S. Geological Survey, Port of Bellingham, and others. We're hoping to assess the future flooding and erosion vulnerability for shorelines in Whatcom County, both coastal and riverine. We want to work to identify what are some of the best adaptation strategies for these shorelines, including a pilot adaptation plan that we'll get into a little later. Want to recommend improvements to policies for those impacted communities. And we want to make sure that we're moving the county and the communities within the county on a path towards a more resilient future.
Thanks, Chris. All right, we're going to touch a little bit more now on what are some of the changes that we can expect to see in our shorelines. And to start, we do want to just hear from everyone in attendance here about what are some concerns that you have about flooding or erosion. And again, if you have that browser open, you can type it in there. You can also use your phone. One brave respondent saying public safety. That is a huge one. I'm seeing a note here in the chat that you might need to refresh the page to be able to type a response. Yep, concerns about roads and bluffs, more need for emergency preparedness, impacts to businesses, repeat flooding for homes and buildings, development still occurring in floodplains, slow progress to mitigate prevention, loss of high bank shorelines. Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's a lot of good impacts here, or good impacts to be aware of. Impacts to salmon and the environment, concerns about being unprepared, resilient communities, waste treatment. All right, yeah, thanks all for sharing. We'll touch on many of these tonight. So as we're talking about what is a future in Whatcom County and what does that look like for flooding and erosion, as I mentioned earlier, currently there's a lot of areas that are already in current floodplains. And as we look to the future with changes in climate, we're expecting to see that area that's impacted grow much larger. And so next I'm going to touch on why are we going to see these increases in flooding and erosion, and then also what does that mean to see those increases. So why are we going to see increases in flooding and erosion? In the Nooksack River, we're going to see changes to precipitation patterns with rainfall and also changes in snowmelt. On the coast, we're going to see sea level rise and all of the associated impacts with that. And then in areas where they meet, like where the Nooksack River meets Puget Sound, those areas are going to continue to see impacts from what we call compound flooding, which is the combination of those two. And a big driver behind all of this is global temperatures, which are increasing. This cool graphic here, each line shows a different year and the temperature measured for that year, and it goes all the way back to 1850. So what this really shows is that our most recent years have been the warmest on record. And going into the future, we see many possibilities of what a future could look like, depending on how much emissions are released and which really drives the increase in temperature. So future choices going into the future really kind of affect the amount of increase we could still see in global temperature. And temperature change is really important for all of these other drivers. So in the Nooksack River, we're going to see a lot of continue to see changes with precipitation. With warmer temperatures, that means that there'll be less snow and more rain, and also earlier snowmelt. We're also going to continue to see changes with precipitation with more intense rainfall, and changes in land use can really amplify these other changes. Research has also shown that in the river and in the region that we're going to see greater stream flow as well, with 20 to 32% higher flow in the 2040s and 52 to 72% higher in the 2080s. So I just want to pause for a second here of when we talk about flood risk, one thing that I think is really important to understand is what does a 100-year event mean, since we talk about those really frequently. And a 100-year event means that there's a 1 in 100 or a 1% chance of that flood occurring in any given year. And so when we think about that risk over a period of time, when we do the math for that, that means that for a 30-year mortgage, something has a 26% chance of seeing an 100-year flood at least once over that 30-year mortgage. Or if we look over an average lifetime, the chance of a home flooding at least once over an average lifetime, if it's exposed to a 100-year flood, might be 55%. So just because an event happens once doesn't mean that it can't happen again the next year and the next year and the next year. So when we look to the future and we're looking at potential flood risk in the Nooksack River, the 100-year floods will also be bigger. So by the 2040s, we're expecting to see the current 100-year flood be about 1.2 times bigger, and in the 2080s, expecting to see that be about 1.75 times bigger. And this is based on modeling work done by the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. On the coast, we know that sea levels are rising. This image here shows the Seattle tide gauge, and sea level rise has risen 8 inches over the past 100 years in Puget Sound, with 4 of those over the last 50 years. And as when we think about what is causing sea level rise, all of the increase in temperature that we've seen over the past decades and centuries, the ocean has actually absorbed much of that heat. So this map of the world here, areas that are in yellows and oranges and reds and purples, show greater increases in sea surface temperature. So just going back to science class here, what causes sea level rise? As water gets warmer, it actually takes up more space. So sea level rise is partially driven by this idea of thermal expansion. As the ocean is absorbing all of that extra heat, it's actually taking up more space. The other part is melting of land ice. So as glaciers and ice caps and ice sheets melt, those also increase the sea surface. And an important note with sea level rise is that we know that it is accelerating. So while we've seen about 8 inches over the past 100 years, and that line looks really linear, it's a straight line. When we look to the future, we see that that line actually accelerates. And so kind of a mid-range scenario, we're looking at about 3 feet in the next 100 years, but really a whole range of probabilities for what is possible there, depending on the emissions and some other factors. And with this, we know that while there's uncertainty about when we're going to see this amount of sea level rise, we do know that sea level rise will continue for centuries because some of this change is already baked in with increases to ocean temperature and increases to air temperatures. And so why do we have this uncertainty? There's uncertainty over how good are our models at modeling things like changes in land ice, but also how quickly we'll be able to reduce emissions in order to reduce the amount of temperature increase that we'll see. And this is really important because sea level rise sets the baseline for flooding and erosion. So I'll kind of skip through some animated slides here. So we have tides and storm surge and wave setup and run up. And sea level rise really pushes all of those up and it increases the baseline for everything. And sea level rise also is important for erosion here. In this image, we can see where maybe we have current high tides or extreme water events. As that water level gets higher, that eats away at the toe of the bluff and allows erosion to progress inland. And so what does it mean for this? What are the impacts that we could expect to see? So greater vulnerability, more risk, with more frequent floods and bigger floods and a higher risk of erosion, as well as more areas and infrastructure that will be exposed to these hazards of flooding and erosion. And so for this project, we're really planning for the future. We're looking at both marine flooding as well as riverine flooding. And we're looking at scenarios based on best available science from the US Geological Survey, from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, from modeling done for the FLIP project, the Floodplain Integrated Planning Project along the Nooksack River that the county and other stakeholders have been working on for many years. And so for coastal areas, we're planning for about 0.8 feet of sea level rise, as well as a 20-year coastal storm for the 2040s. And then for more of a midterm scenario, we're looking at 3.3 feet of sea level rise for that time. And both of these correspond to about a 1% chance of occurring. And we realize that there's kind of a range of years over which we could see these rise amounts, but it's important to have a threshold that we're planning for. And for the Nooksack River, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at also two scenarios for that. So one in the 2040s, which is about 1.2 times the current 100-year flood. And then for the 2080s, a scenario of about 1.75 times the 100-year flood. And that modeling comes from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. And so what might this look like in coastal areas? This map here on the right shows parts of the Whatcom shoreline that would be exposed in a 3.3 feet sea level rise plus a 20-year coastal storm scenario. And so with this, as sea level rise raises the baseline, we'll expect to see higher water level during coastal storms. And so water able to reach further inland and cover more areas, and also water have a harder time draining. And we're also going to see more frequent high tide flooding. So historically, we've seen on average, and this is based on data from Cherry Point, we've seen over the past 10 years, high tide flooding of about 1.8 days per year. And future projections show that for the 2040s, that could be closer to 4 days per year. And in the 2080s, that could be closer to 25 days per year. So with rising sea level, it really increases the baseline for both kind of that nuisance flooding as well as those bigger events. And with that, we also will see changes with bluff erosion, and especially as water levels increase and accelerate, that we'll see erosion correspond to that as well. But also important to note that erosion can be impacted by other things like precipitation and land use and management. That can also cause erosion from the top of the bluff as well as from the toe. And so what might this look like along the Nooksack River shorelines? We could expect to see more frequent river flooding as well as bigger floods. So for the 2040s, again, much larger than the current 100-year. And for the 2080s, also much larger than the current 100-year. And with that, with higher water levels, we could expect to see more erosion of riverbanks and areas that stay underwater for a longer period of time as the soil gets saturated and it's harder for water to drain. And what's at risk for all of this? So as part of our study, we're doing a vulnerability assessment where we're looking at infrastructure and assets across the county. And so this includes roads, buildings, emergency services, critical facilities, sewer lines, wastewater treatment plants, outfalls, water infrastructure like drinking water treatment plants and water lines. And we're mapping that to see where that infrastructure overlaps with future hazard areas so that we understand what might be impacted in the 2040s and what might be impacted in the 2080s and beyond. And this is really important because it helps us be able to plan for that. So in this image here, red shows things that will be vulnerable in the more near term, whereas orange shows what might be more vulnerable in the longer term. And this will be a really helpful tool for planning to help make decisions about where future investments may want to be made. And so all of this is really important to help inform adaptation planning. It gives us a better sense of what's at risk and when we might start to see those changes, and to be proactive to help avoid the worst of some of the potential danger and destruction and expense, and to make investments that are forward-looking in order to have more resilient shorelines and more resilient infrastructure in the future. And with this, we're also looking to other places across the country for where we can learn from strategies that they're using that could inform what we're doing here. And with that, I will pass it to Mike Chang to talk more about what are some of the adaptation strategies that we can use to address some of this vulnerability.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Chang. I'm a director at Cascadia Consulting Group. Reminder that we have the chat. So as questions come up for yourself, you can use the chat to add your question. We will have a Q&A time following this presentation as well. So in thinking about adaptation strategies, Rachel teed it up really well in terms of what we want to do is we want to understand what are the current risks and vulnerabilities, especially what is at risk and who is at risk. And so what that really frames up is this next part of this project, which is beginning to prepare for these risks in and of itself. So starting with kind of at a very high level, where we want to start is what are our general adaptation goals? At a high level, what do we want to do with this? And I think a lot of what we have here mirrors a lot of the input provided actually in the first two poll everywhere questions we have today. So when we think about adaptation goals, what we really try to aim for is find strategies that really mitigate or reduce risks and vulnerabilities. In doing so, we also want to make sure that the systems, assets, and communities that are exposed to specific hazards, they have the ability to adapt or cope with future climate change. So not just risk today, but also risk in the future. And whenever possible, we also want to ensure that we also support other types of co-benefits, whether that is also supporting public health outcomes, cost-saving outcomes, and ensuring that we confer some of these benefits to other things that people value as well. What we also want to do is provide considerations of adaptation as well. So oftentimes kind of adaptation objectives may depend on scale and geography. So we really focus on these two things because the scale of what you're at really determines who is leading or who is in charge of implementing adaptation actions, whether that is at the municipal scale or at the county scale, or even potentially working with state and federal partners. And thinking about geography, this is also really important because it really understanding the geographic considerations allows us to understand what is the risk and hazard profile of specific localities. And we know that oftentimes with adaptation, it isn't a one-size-fit-all approach. Finally, kind of what we say about adaptation is oftentimes adaptation is a values-driven decision. My background's kind of in the social sciences, so we say that adaptation choices are values choices. So there's a lot of different factors to be considering when we think about what is the best adaptation pathway or set of strategies for a community to implement. And they're based upon a lot of things such as what is the risk tolerance of that community, what are the specific values and priorities of that community, and what's the compatibility with current uses or desired future uses within the community as well. As part of this effort, what we're also doing is we're beginning to pull together a library of adaptation strategies, both implemented across Washington state, as well as pulled from best practices and other types of flooding and erosion adaptation efforts across the whole country. And so there's a lot of different types of dimensions in terms of how we consider adaptation considerations. This includes understanding what is the specific hazard it addresses. Does it address flooding, erosion, or both? And if it addresses flooding, does it address coastal flooding or riverine flooding? What are the types of levers being used? So this could include capital projects, land use planning, additional scientific monitoring, or other nature-based solutions that require restoration of habitats or floodplains. What we also are trying to understand is what are the specific assets it addresses. So it could be about structures, utilities, roads, or other types of assets like that. There's also different types of strategies focusing on existing development as well as new development. And with each strategy, there's a lot of different other considerations, including who typically should lead it, who has the jurisdictional authority to implement, what is the time frame for implementation, and alongside with that, if we implement, what is the estimated time frame of protection? Like a lot of things, there are potential costs associated with implementation. So how much does it cost and who pays for it? Again, things like scale, ongoing maintenance needs, and also permitting feasibility are all different types of considerations when we think about adaptation options. And so I wanted to provide a high level about what are some of the categories of adaptation that feel particularly relevant for Whatcom County. So oftentimes there are short-term solutions. So short-term solutions are often focused on emergency responses following an extreme hazard event. So this could include temporary flood protections like sandbags or floodgates, or also updating emergency response protocols. There are also near-term solutions, and oftentimes these near-term solutions focuses on modifying existing codes or policies. And so this oftentimes ensures that existing buildings are flood-proof, or that we implement or update best management practices, such as how we manage storm water and runoff drainage or beach nourishment practices. And this can help reduce the risk of flooding and erosion hazards. What we want to note is these types of solutions can often offer protection in the near term, but many assets that are already vulnerable to key hazards and risks may also require other strategies in coordination with these near-term strategies. Next, we also wanted to offer some examples of midterm solutions. So solutions that offer protection through the 2080s are oftentimes solutions that focus on protecting assets from future flooding. So these can either use natural solutions, so this includes soft armoring or nature-based solutions that lean on restoring floodplains and habitats. A great example of that is the berm in Birch Bay. It can also rely on physical tactics, such as hard armoring structures, such as seawalls, or elevating assets above a certain base threshold. One note is while these two, both the natural solutions as well as hard physical solutions, while they might offer similar timeframes of protection, we want to know that there are trade-offs between these strategies. So for example, utilizing a hard armoring tactic may prohibit or make it harder for a nature-based solution strategy to be utilized in that same location in the future. Finally, long-term solutions really focuses on strategies that really focus on two main objectives, either removing assets from hazardous areas, and this can include acquiring land and structures in hazardous areas, and then also focusing development in non-hazardous areas. And this can be done through either zoning codes or restricting new development in hazardous areas as well. One thing we want to note is that for midterm and long-term solutions, while they offer longer timeframes of protection, oftentimes we need to begin thinking about implementing these strategies early on. We know that beginning to think about these strategies now can make sure that there is timely implementation and effect of these. One last thing in terms of adaptation is we also recognize that there are a lot of various kind of land and property ownership considerations. And so really a lot, what is needed throughout this process is really focusing on outreach and education elements on how do we communicate flood risks and how to prepare for them for a variety of different land and property owners as well. Like I said before, finally, we offer a lot of these different types of adaptation strategies, but what we also know is that there is not a single silver bullet that can help solve all of these adaptation strategies. And oftentimes these strategies will be needed to be implemented in sequence as well as in parallel. And so just some of the considerations of how we sequence adaptation strategies, oftentimes there are natural sequencing of actions. So for example, before we restore or relocate certain assets, we need to make sure that we have land acquisition strategies implemented beforehand. Like I said earlier, we also need to understand what are the trade-offs between the strategies, because implementing some strategies now may prohibit implementation of other strategies later on. So with this, we're going to go to our next poll everywhere here and really thinking about what types of adaptation strategies resonate with you and why. And again, you might need to refresh your monitor as well. So actually a strong theme of relocation, relocating roads, buildings, infrastructures, but also recognizing some of the considerations of that. Not just relocation assets, but also, I think earlier there was also someone who mentioned the public safety dimensions of adaptation, so getting folks out of the danger zone. Great. And seeing restoration of habitats and natural floodplains. Berms and seawalls. Wonderful. And there's already great example of the berm within Birch Bay. And we also know with the nature of some that we need to make sure that we're preparing for strategies that offer protection, right? Utilizing zoning policies and great sequence and better zoning policies might help encourage growth outside of flood areas. I'm going to move to the next slide, but this poll should still be live. So if you have other ideas, we'd love to continue hearing from you through the poll everywhere.
Hey, Mike, just wanted to flag there's a contribution in the chat, change of zoning laws to prevent new building in flood zones, and then also a question about relocation, which I think we could take in just a minute when we go to Q&A.
Great. Wonderful. Yeah, and if poll everywhere isn't working for you, adding things in the chat is super helpful as well. We'll be downloading a copy of the chat following this workshop. All right, well, maybe we will segue into a Q&A time period. I might stop sharing my screen so I'm able to see the chat and see folks. Great. So a reminder is if you have any additional questions, you can please add them in the chat and we will answer them. So first question from Audrey. Would using some of the longer term strategies like relocating structures and increasing building in safer areas be better to do in the short term to solve some problems quicker and in a more sustainable way? Wonderful. Maybe I'll see if anyone from the project team has an initial thought. I think one of the things that I just want to indicate, and I can reshare the screen in a second, is that what we organize the strategies is the estimated time frame of protection. So a strategy like relocating an asset or a structure outside of a hazardous area is expected to offer protection from future flooding and erosion risks in the long term. That being said, just because it offers protection in the long term doesn't necessarily mean it is a long-term, the implementation is long-term. And so there are a lot of opportunities to be thinking about what are current opportunities to either think about how do we relocate assets out of hazardous areas, as well as revising zoning policies to encourage development in non-hazardous areas. So I just wanted to make sure that that was delineated and that the estimated time frame of protection isn't necessarily the time frame for implementation.
Yeah, Mike, I would just add in with that. That was a great question, Audrey. And definitely, there are also cost savings by doing things in the near term because then you are avoiding some of the added costs from dealing with damage in the future. So that there is an element to that as well. Very important to be thinking proactively about how long things take. And some things like infrastructure have a relatively long design lifetime too. So if something's being designed to last for, 50, 60, 70 years, it's important to think about what the future conditions are going to be throughout the whole lifetime of that infrastructure as well.
I see from Gwen, and I think maybe this is a response to the question, changing zoning laws to prevent new building in flood zones. Yeah. And Audrey, no worries about, you did not misunderstand the slide. We threw a lot of information at you today. So these clarifying questions are very helpful. All right, well, definitely if you have any additional questions, please feel free to add them in the chat. We will answer them as they come up. So I will reshare my screen. Great. Are y'all able to see this question and answer slide again?
Yes, we can. And we definitely have time for more questions if folks are shy and want to chime in. We're happy to answer them.
So I'm going to pass it back to Rachel and Chris to provide kind of a summary and what are the next steps we go from here.
Yeah, great. We can do that. And if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pause and answer those. So we are curious. As Mike said, we did throw a lot of information at folks. And so we're interested to know what's something that you'll take away from this brief workshop today to learn more about the Whatcom Future Shorelines project. And Osama just put the link in the chat again. So if you navigated away from the poll everywhere slide, that should take you back. And I see some questions coming in, so I'll take those after this poll.
The word cloud might be maybe not the best way to see what people are submitting, but we'll have your comments to read through after the fact.
I'm guessing maybe some variation of helpful to understand what the county is doing. So that's great. We're glad to hear that. Give it another minute for folks to put stuff in. Yeah, guessing we might have to dig into some of these, but some good words here. Proactive, changes, work, understand. Thank you all for giving your responses there. All right, maybe as people are still, or actually maybe let's go back one. As folks are still filling that in, I can take a quick pause and just answer a couple of the questions in the chat. There's a question from Audrey. Is there a list of agencies or departments who have been involved and will be involved in this project going forward? That's a great question. I believe that as we develop the final materials for this project wraps up in June, there'll be information on Whatcom County's website with information about the kind of final conclusions for the project and the work that was done. And with that, we'll include an acknowledgement of the different agencies and departments and partners who've been involved with that. As Chris mentioned up front, we have representatives on a project team that meets about every other month, that includes all of the cities in Whatcom County along the marine shoreline, as well as along the Nooksack River, includes Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, and also folks from Port of Bellingham, and then as well as some state representatives from Washington Sea Grant, and DNR. I don't want to forget someone. Also from the USGS. So we've got a great project team here. And then I see a question from Bill here. How do you see the phasing out of existing areas of development? That is a hefty question. And that is something that we see this work as really starting the conversation for that of being able to look to the future and see what some of the changes are in the time period over which we might expect those. And also looking at taking a deeper dive at some of the policy approaches and levers that could be used to help reduce the new construction or reduce development in areas that we know that there could be a lot of continued impacts. So looking into what could be possible for that, both in more of a near term and a midterm. All right, maybe we'll move to the next slide then. So Chris, I'll pass this to you for some of our wrap up here. And then if folks have other questions, you're welcome to put those in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll do our best to respond to those.
Yep, thanks, Rachel and Mike. I just had one other thought on that previous question about who was involved. Another thing just to be aware of is that the Washington State Department of Ecology is also doing their own degree of kind of sea level rise impact and future riverine flood planning, and trying to review their own kind of guidelines and direction to provide out to local governments. So I think the good news is we're a little bit ahead of the curve, and the bad news is we're a little bit ahead of the curve. So it is great to see other agencies across the state also try to engage in this proactive planning to understand what level of risk do we have and how do we mitigate that risk to the best of our ability. So you could definitely tell today was intended to be kind of a introductory workshop, lets you get a sense for why we're doing this, what we've learned, what we think are some of the best approaches moving forward. We do have our second workshop coming up next Tuesday in Birch Bay at the North Bay Community Church. I put the registration link in the chat. We do require registration for you to attend, but that'll be a 2-hour in-person workshop. We're going to get a little bit more into the weeds, have maps up of the Birch Bay community, try to get a little bit more granular, try to get feedback from folks that live in that area, find out what their concerns are, what some of their ideas are on how to best move forward. And I think to kind of Bill's question earlier, a lot of the intent of this effort was really to collect all of that data so that we have it at hand to have some of those bigger, harder conversations. It's going to be years, decades, multiple decades to really develop and implement the best plan for the community. So yeah, we're kind of just getting started. Next slide, please. The other thing I'll share you, I know a lot of you are probably looking at the small maps on the screen and wanting to do a little bit more of a deep dive. The county does have up on their website all of the results from our phase 1 project, which includes a story map, which provides a lot of the information that Rachel ran through in a short time frame, and also has an interactive map for you to be able to look at what we modeled under phase one, which includes all the sea level rise impacts, except bluff erosion, and includes the riverine flood predictions up to Ferndale. So we are working to update that map with our current phase two data. That should be on that same webpage within the next month or two, and allow you to dig a little bit deeper. So you can see there where we are on our timeline. Birch Bay workshop coming up in a month here, and that final report and story map will be released sometime in June. I'm very appreciative for everyone joining today. You go to the next slide, Mike. And appreciate the interest. If you don't have my email, I'll put it in the chat here momentarily. Feel free to reach out to us. I'm certainly available to try to deconstruct some of the data we went through. Happy to explain. Will be available into the future. It's a big conversation, and appreciate everyone coming along with us. And we do have a couple more minutes, so if there are any other outstanding questions, feel free to put them on the chat, and we'll stay around a little bit longer. If you want to sign off, thanks for attending. See your comment, Kim, repost. There you go.
No more questions?